Good evening. Welcome to the final Q&A of 2014. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, young entrepreneur and chair of the G20 Youth Summit, Holly Ransom. The founder of the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership, Noel Pearson. Celebrated actor and self-proclaimed anarchist, James Cromwell, who's in Australia to play Rupert Murdoch on stage. Former Ambassador and Howard Government Minister, Amanda Vanstone. Columnist and author and host of Radio National Drive, Waleed Ali. Please welcome our panel. You can join the Twitter conversation by using the Quanda hashtag. If you've got a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it. So this, as I said, is the last Q&A for the year. There's a lot of talk about. Let's get straight to our first question, which is from Tony Hay.
Thanks, Tony. Do we need a new criminal offence for misleading or deceptive conduct in order to obtain public office or to form government?
Holly Ransom.
Throw me the opener. Good question. I mean, I think it's an interesting one. I'm assuming you're referring, obviously, to the state of broken promises, the much talked about conversation at the moment, obviously brought to light by what's happened with the ABC cuts. I think it is an interesting one because for me, it comes back down to integrity. You know, I'm a big believer in that being a fundamental value, and that means for me, you know, doing what you say and saying what you mean. And I think one of the interesting things about the state of politics right now is I think there's an expectation, unfortunately, that when parties are talking to us pre an election, that we take it with a giant grain of salt. And I think it's a shame, unfortunately, as much as we as a general public have a little bit of allowance for the fact that you can find yourself in a different reality when you form government, and that can create some challenges to delivering on your agenda. I think certainly with the way that things have played out and frustrations, what I've been, I think, encouraged to see is the fact that the Australian public are really holding governments to account, and the fact, you know, the discourse this week, the public conversation, the talk, the chatter on Twitter, everywhere. I think it's really good to see that we're stepping up the fact that it should be that you say what you mean, and absolutely we will hold you to account for what's said during an election.
You'd stop short of making it a criminal offence.
Look, yeah, I think we'd stop short of that, but I think it is important that we continue to bring accountability and greater levels of transparency to the public debate, and it shouldn't be an accepted way of being that our politicians are able to get up in front of us and make promises that they don't follow through on.
I'll quickly go to our second questioner, Nicholas White, who's got a slightly different solution to this problem. Nicholas?
Thanks, Tony. Considering that just before the last election, our Prime Minister pretty much made sweeping direct promises that there would be no cuts to health, there'd be no cuts to education, no cuts to the ABC, no cuts to the SBS, it now seems to be that the government is working against the mandate that we keep hearing about. In these situations, do you think voters should have the right to remove the representatives that they've elected you know, for reversing the course of what they have directly and clearly promised?
Noel Pearson.
Well, it depends what promises we're disappointed about. The Newman government promised to acquiesce to our 5-year fight against Wild River conservation laws that impinged on Indigenous land rights, and 2.5 years later they haven't acted on it. In fact, they've introduced a regime that reinforces the scheme that Labor had. So I'd like to put them in prison as well, but possibly in pursuit of a cause that our audience might not support.
What about more broadly, the Queensland government's one case? The questioner mentioned the federal government.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's a great deal of disingenuousness about this. I think that it's very apparent in federal elections which promises are going to be upheld and which promises are put out there.
So you mark them off, do you? The fake ones and the real ones?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's, unfortunately, we go for the easy ones every time.
Amanda Vanstone, do leaders have a right or even a responsibility to change their minds, to change their election problems, or should, as the question has asked, there be some penalty for doing so?
Well, I think leaders have a responsibility to do what they believe is in the best interest of the nation at the time when they make the decision. That's what you elect them to do. I think there is a problem with, and not just in Australia, internationally, with a disappointment, if you like, disaffection or distance between parliaments and the public, and a good part of that is the public not believing they're being told what's actually happening. I think a part of that comes back to, and so politicians do say things, and I believe they believe it at the time, that that's what they're going to do, and they get in there and think, holy mother of... we've got to do something different. No one wants to be in that position of going and saying, I know I said this, but now I'm going to do that. That's not as if any politician, Liberal or Labor or any other party, thinks that's a great idea. I think part of the problem is us, reflected through the media, where what we want people to say before an election is only good things. As if we imagine, and we know this and we sit at home, that it's not true. Government's not about giving out stuff and always being good. It's the wrong end of the job, actually. It's the wrong end of the pineapple, where you have to make really hard decisions. But when we come to the election, we only want to hear the good things. And we push people into saying what we want to hear, because we only want the good things. And as soon as someone says, well, I might have to look at that, it gets blown up into a world. It's going to be a disaster.
Well,
So
I mean,
I think
can I
we're
just say...
all in this together.
Tony Abbott was pretty good at making it appear to be a disaster. He referred to the previous government dying of shame because of its broken promises. I mean, is he in danger here of being hoisted with his own petard?
Well, I think at the next election, voters will decide who they want, and between largely the two major parties, they'll make a decision as to in whom they have greater trust or otherwise.
Waleed?
Yes, that's the definition of an election. But,
yeah.
But the question is really whether or not Tony Abbott's going to pay as a result. It's got to a point.
Well, that's
it's
my
too
point.
far
The next
gone.
election, I mean, I knew that was the definition of election. But
Yeah.
after 3 years of being in government, the community will have had a chance to say, well, this is what you said last time, and we've judged you on that, and this is your judgment day, and they'll either give it a tick or not.
I really like one of the points Amanda just made there about how we're kind of all in this together. There is a problem in the...
Team Australia.
Well, that's a slightly separate issue, but yes. But there is, I think, a problem in our political discourse where we expect, effectively, there to be no losers for anything that we do. And so the minute a politician is in a situation where they're being asked to identify who the losers are going to be, they will back away from that because they know that any loser that's identified will suddenly make political life impossible for them, and there will be a populist response from the other side of politics that will ram home the advantage. Now, Tony Abbott is in no position to complain about this, given he was so masterful at deploying it when he was opposition leader, but that is nonetheless the dynamic of our politics. I actually don't mind it when politicians break promises, depending on what the promises are, the circumstances in which they made the promise, and then the circumstances at the time they decide to ditch the promise. It's possible, for example, that you could find that the world has changed so much from the moment that you promised something to the moment that you have to revise that decision that it's eminently justifiable. I think the difficulty with Tony Abbott's position, though, is that when you add up all the promises he was making before the election, they were mutually contradictory. So it was like, well, we're going to get the budget back into surplus. We're going to do that. And we're going to do it without any new taxes. And we're going to get rid of a couple of taxes, including one that raises billions of dollars. And we're not going to cut anything. And when you do that, I mean, that's magic pudding politics. And it was always going to fall over at some stage. It was really just a question of whether or not he was going to pick something that was going to ignite enough of the electorate to turn against him. And he might just have done it here. To this point, I never believed that we were looking at a one-term government. I still think it's unlikely. But this week's the first week I felt it's possible.
Let me bring in an outsider here for your perspective, Jamie. What do you think about, we're listening to this, but it's universal, isn't it? Promises and politics in elections.
Well, I like the idea of politicians going to jail because I think every politician should experience what it's like to be in jail, and I got a friend. But it's interesting. We elected our president on the basis of a promise, and it was quite an extraordinary promise. It was a unique opportunity to redress an issue in our country of our racism and our exploitation of people of color, and specifically black people. And the hope was that that youth and that charm and that energy and that dream would be fulfilled, and we sold it to ourselves. We still have an idea that there is a difference between these two parties, which is not true any longer. They are both the same party with different names, that they actually stand for something, issues that concern us as individuals and as citizens, rather than the special interests they represent.
That's although the Republicans wouldn't say that. They'd say Obamacare was the greatest mistake of this president, and they'll sort of overturn it at the first opportunity.
Well, they've tried how many times to overturn it, but the interesting thing is they all get, and they will get, Medicare, and that's a single-payer system operated by the United States government, and everybody in America loves it. And Obama did not even allow the discussion of single-payer to occur during the debate on Obamacare. And Obamacare basically is a subsidy for the insurance industry because people are required to buy the insurance, and insurance, in order to cover the expenses of covering people who were uninsurable before, have reduced the amount of coverage in the individual policy so that the policies are not as good. So you see that it's just the same thing as he offered in this immigration bill. They make it sound really great, and then when you read the fine print, they've managed to screw somebody. I don't know why we continue as citizens to believe that these promises will be fulfilled. They never have been fulfilled, and we keep on going back to the same well. I thought, rats are smarter. They go down the maze once or twice, and when they find that there's no food at the end of it, they stop doing it. But human beings will continue down that maze because they got it once and they're going to get it again.
Our questioner has his hand up. Nicholas.
Thanks, Tony. I think the only thing that I would say, I completely accept that, you might, before government, feel one way and say something, and then you might make it to government and you might realize, well, hey, things are different. And so, of course, there's going to be these situations where, this is accepted by the community. I just feel with some of the promises that we've had, they're actually very direct, they're very sweeping, they're very wide, they're very measurable, and they're very quantifiable. And I just think that 3 years is a really long time to say, oh, that's cool, we'll get our chance in a third of a decade. It's a really long time to punish, I guess, for lies.
Okay, Nicholas, we'll take that as a comment. Thank you very much. Q&A is live across Australia. It's simulcast on ABC News 24, News Radio and Australia Plus. Our next question tonight comes from Yvonne Stern.
Hi, my question is the Prime Minister, Abbott, is proposing a 1 cent petrol tax. In essence, and in reality, we're going to benefit or lose more than that when the supermarkets decide to stop their promoting of the fuel bonuses and point system that they're going to do in the near future. My question is, why does the Liberal Party seem to sit in the background and allow the Labor Party to discredit their policies regarding the budget?
Amanda Vanstone.
Thanks. Look, I'm not a spokesman for the Liberal Party. I think my subs might be a bit out of date, but I'll redo them. So I'm a committed Liberal, that's true, but I'm not a spokesperson for the government. I actually think we have to have collectively a more mature discussion about where we want our money to come from. For example, I think the premiers should get together and agree that they want a rise in the GST, because they get all that money, and the states, some of the states clearly haven't got enough money to do what they need to do. We can keep asking for more and imagine there is a magic pudding out of which it's going to come, but it's not. I think we should reorganise some of the Commonwealth and state responsibilities so that we don't have, for example, an army of public servants checking on schools, both at the federal government and state government level. Clean up our system of government. It's never going to be attractive because no government will want to lose anything, but we should do that. A tax on petrol increase in that is a pretty efficient way of getting money from people who use the roads. So can I just say, my bottom line position is, look, if you want governments to do things, you've got to expect them to get the money from somewhere, and if every time we have a discussion, as you say, of, well, who's going to lose out of this, you'll have the same tax arrangements that we've got now, the same inadequate funding for the level of things that we want done.
So, Amanda, I guess the heart of that question, probably will come back to you if you like, just in just a moment. But the heart of that question is the notion that the Liberal Party is not selling its message properly. In the Australian, over the weekend, there's a claim that the Liberal Party, the government, does not have a narrative. Andrew Bolt, right-wing commentator, says the government must change or die. Is there a problem with the way this government is going at the moment?
Well, the budget clearly haven't got through everything they want to get through, so for anyone that's a problem because you need the money to do the things that you have committed to doing. Who's at fault in that? Really, that's not for me to say. Just not for me. I'm not the arbiter of who hasn't done a good enough job or not. They haven't sold the policies well enough to get them through the Parliament, and that's a problem. Clearly, that's a problem.
I reckon you have a cracking opinion on who's to blame, actually.
Well, bear in mind, look, let me speak in generalities.
All right, now we get
I've been
Since you're not a party spokesman anymore, could you speak in specifics?
I'll go back to when I was a minister and when I had some really tough decisions to implement. And I'll tell you what you generally find, this is human nature, largely. I don't think it's just in politics. I think it's in business, it's everywhere. That when you're the one that's got the tough stuff to do, don't look around and expect too many of your colleagues to be behind you. You'll be left out like a shag on a rock.
Do you have the same thing we have? The taxes are passed on to those.
You mean the right to carry arms?
No.
Why don't you do something about that?
That I disagree. Why don't I do something about that? Like that. That's a politician. Well, that's a very general question.
Take it up as an issue.
That was a little joke. We haven't got time for that.
Is everybody in Australia, including the corporations, paying their fair share of taxes? Because in America, our largest corporations pay very little taxes. In fact, Mr. Murdoch pays, I think, 7% on the billions that he makes. And that's where, if you have a shortfall, you raise the GST or you raise petrol tax and then goes to individuals. What happens to the people who can really afford it? They'll say, oh no, capitalism is the engine that drives the economy forward, that creates the jobs. You can't tax us. But of course, if you don't, then you don't have a country.
I'm going to go back to our questioner, Yvonne. You had your hand up. Do you want to get...
My issue wasn't the actual 1% tax. I mean, that to me is a non-event because we are going to lose more in our 4 cents from Woolies, for example, when they take that back from us. So 1 cent, I don't understand why everyone has jumped up and down about a 1 cent tax. We pay more than that on a fluctuating weekly cycle. My point is, no matter what the government come out with on their policies and their budgets, they put it out there. The opposition jump on it and attack, which is what you want the opposition to do, and then you don't hear anything back. It's like, well, Liberal Party have gone to ground. Like, we don't hear any rebuttal, we don't hear any justification. It just seems that they're letting Labor's just walk all over them.
Let's hear Noel Pearson on this. Looking at the polls, what we've seen is a progressive decline, in fact, a long-term decline in the government's polling numbers. What do you put that down to?
Well, I think that the Australian people have got to create a constituency for sensible policies. And the situation the government faces, I think, is a consequence of a long history of the constituents from the left saying right bad and the constituents from the right saying left bad, when we really should be creating a radical centre around which all Australians can see good for the nation, and politicians like Abbott and Shorten can respond to that constituency. We're asking them to show, to do the right thing by us, but we don't create a constituency for the right policies. Amanda Vanstone talked about raising the GST. I agree with her, actually. But when are we going to have a constituency around that? We want better services. We want the ABC properly funded, but we've got to raise money to do that. And unfortunately in Australia, we're in these two tribes and the leaders are responding to those two tribes. And we don't have a constituency in the Australian community that's out to support a radical combination of the left and right positions.
So, Noel, doesn't that require political leadership? And of course, if you're running the government, you are the ultimate political leader of the country.
Yeah, but as I say, I think that we've now a long way into a situation where leaders are not really leading. They're responding to our unrealistic hopes that we can have a fully funded ABC without, say, raising the GST or raising other forms of revenue and so on, you know. And I think that the Australian people have got to create an imperative for leaders to respond to. And I think that Tony Abbott will lead a second term. I think that there will not be a change in this first term, but certainly he's got to be worried.
Yeah, Holly.
I mean, it's interesting, as you pointed out, Yvonne, we've got this polarising state of politics back, and we're pretty accustomed to that now. That tends to be the playoff between our government and our opposition. I think the thing that's interesting when you add on the state of play that we have in the upper house right now, how much that's exacerbating really this sensationalism and lack of conversation, to go to Noel's point. You know, we're not having robust policy conversations. We're getting pulled to the margins. We're getting pulled to more of the politicking and the posturing and the power plays than we are to actually what's the policy that's going to lead the nation forward, that's going to allow us to tackle some of the really big intergenerational issues we've got right now. I think part of it for me is very much bottom up. I think I fully encourage as many Australians to get their voice actively into the conversation, talk to MPs, gather in organisations, put their voices forward in whatever means available to them. But I also think it's important that our leaders facilitate the opportunity for those, for that engagement, for that conversation to be had, for those inputs to be actually generated and put into something substantive. So I think it's bottom up and top down for me.
But picking up Noel and Amanda's point, I mean, you can't imagine a kind of public bottom up movement to raise the GST, can you? And the point is, they're saying without creating a new tax base, you won't be able to pay for everything.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's where absolutely political leadership is necessary. I think 2015 will be really interesting for us as a country because the government have commissioned a lot of white papers. You know, we've got the look into federalism. We've got the discussion about what we're going to do with the Australian taxation system. Also, internationally, we've got the opportunity to lead with our role in the Security Council on what the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals look like. All of those are conversations that there will be the platform for us to have a voice in. Government will be leading it anyway, and it's important we as a population rally around it.
Over this side, brief comments from both Waleed and Amanda.
I've had the experience of the first year in government. It's horrific, to be frank. You go from 10 or 11 years, in this case 7 years of opposition. It's a new body of people, not all of them with experience as ministers. You work with a public service that you don't know that well because you haven't worked with them at that level. There's a lot to sort out in the first year. The Howard government, remember, had in 97 what they called annus horribilis. And to take Holly's point, one clearly in 98 proposing a new tax. So I think if you take the Australian people into your confidence, tell them why you think something needs to be done and have that rational conversation, you will get elected and you can get over your first term blues.
Waleed,
I think there's truth in that. We shouldn't forget, though, in 98 they lost the popular vote, so it was skin of the teeth stuff. But I think one of the points that's being made here...
You mean they didn't get re-elected and it was sort of an accident that I was still a minister? I mean, they didn't get re-elected.
Hey, I can't comment on your ministry, but I can... But no,
they got re-elected.
They got re-elected, yeah, but they lost the popular vote.
Proposing a new tax.
I agree. It was a magnificent feat. I'm just saying it was a lot closer than this being a formula for success. But I think there's a point that needs to be raised here, and that is there is a reason that the government is struggling at the moment. And it is not as simple as the country's really polarised and there can be no accommodation and so governments just fall over. It's that their narrative is not entirely clear, but the narrative against them is brutally clear. The narrative against them is that in their decisions that they are making in order to fix the budget, for example, they're doing so in a way that is, for whatever this means, unfair. That it is falling disproportionately on those who can least bear the burden. That's the reason that the government came up with the idea of a debt levy, which was itself a broken promise, but is not a broken promise anyone cares about because it imposes the cost on the wealthiest people. It is, however, unfortunately, the only measure about which the government can say that, and it is temporary. Yet all the other measures that have created such a huge storm in the public have been those that are regressive in some kind of way. They fall on low-income earners. The petrol excise, the fuel excise, wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the government could begin a conversation about how you do that in a way that's not regressive. And Joe Hockey's attempt to do that was to say, well, poor people don't drive cars. But, well, not as much. So
Unless they live in the western suburbs of major cities and have to drive to work and back from work.
Now, the GST, it's actually, I think the GST does need to be raised, and we do need to have a debate on it, but you can only begin to have that debate on it when you confront head-on the claim that the GST is a regressive tax because poor people are hit hardest. And once you acknowledge that fact, then you can begin, as John Howard did, you can begin a process of figuring out how to offset that consequence, how to, you do it through tax cuts in income or whatever it might be. But because the
government... And he did it with an amalgam of social welfare groups backing his tax rise.
So the problem, I don't think, is that reform is necessarily impossible or the country is hopelessly polarised or whatever it is. It's not even just that there can be no losers in our politics. I think the Australian populace understood that budget reform was probably needed at some level. What they wanted to see was that it was fair, that everybody was actually contributing something to it. And I think that's the test that the government has so far failed. As to whether or not they can rectify that in the space of 2 years, I don't know. I actually fear that the public might have made up their mind on this.
OK, we're going to move on. We've got quite a few questions to get to. Our next one is from Nick Cleary. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Mine's for James Cromwell, actually. Just, he may have already answered part of this question. With your research and study into Rupert Murdoch for your new play, obviously I was just wondering your opinion on whether Rupert Murdoch is a tyrannical political kingmaker and social dictator, or more a misunderstood social commentator and business genius.
Jamie.
That's an either-or question.
A little bit.
Not to polarise it.
He certainly is an extraordinary businessman. I mean, he's incredibly successful. I always say who he is as a human being, I have no idea. The phenomenon of Rupert Murdoch is similar to many other magnates, the masters of the universe. The irreparable harm he has done to this dialogue in my country, and I sort of believe in England as well, and most likely here, is that his voice and his point of view dominates not only the conversation, but the politics that create the conversation. And that is to the detriment, because he has a narrow self-interest. As was pointed out to me today, his portfolio, his companies are connected to the extraction industries in a very subtle but conscious way. And so his opposition to renewable energy and to the phenomenon of global warming is simply the short view. I believe that applies, I mean, in my country, on practically every issue. Fox News is the determinant to a public that has no other option, that hears no other voice but his, that cannot distinguish between opinion and fact, that listens to the ranting of people who are innately racists, xenophobes, warmongers, and they don't hear the attribution of the people on the panels that they are paid by the defense industry, that they are supporting wars that benefit them and the companies that they represent. And all this is part of the modus operandi of the man, which I think is very, very dangerous and needs to be exposed and opposed. And that's what our play is about.
Noel Pearson, I'll come back to you if you want to ask something. Noel, you've got a very different take on Rupert Murdoch, at least judging by your speech at the 50th anniversary of the Australian newspaper.
Yeah. I mean, without the support of the Australian over the last 15 years, I don't think we would have made the ground we have in Indigenous affairs. I think a reorientation in Indigenous affairs was necessary. And quite frankly, the Australian was the only national media vehicle that got behind that. I also think that in prospect, such as with constitutional reform, recognising Indigenous Australians, that quite frankly, Rupert Murdoch is probably one of, I would say, 5 or 6 people who are absolutely key to a successful referendum. I would count Paul Keating and John Howard as the other two white Australians who were key to that success, as well as Patrick Dodson and Lowitja O'Donoghue. So I understand the whole critique of News Corporation and Murdoch and so on, but when it comes to Indigenous affairs in this country, Murdoch has a history that goes back to the Stewart case for the Adelaide Advertiser in 1959, the fight against the death penalty for Max Stewart, and his flagship paper in particular has been completely assiduous in its support of what I would say is a right set of radical centre politics. And that might not be beautiful music to the ears of people on the left, but I would argue that the radical centre policies that we are trying to prosecute here are absolutely essential for Indigenous people.
Holly Ransom, let's bring in you. Tyrannical political kingmaker and social dictator, or misunderstood social commentator and business genius? That was the question.
Yeah, as you said, does it have to be an either or? I mean, to some degree, I think the two comments there highlight exactly the sort of figure that Murdoch is. He's one that does draw out incredibly different opinions from people. He polarises. People love him, they hate him. They're generally not somewhere in between. And I think the really interesting thing about this play, I'm intrigued for James to take on someone that he has such strong views about, and to be able to encompass that man and be able to, play that character. I think for me, it just highlights the point of the importance of diversity of actors within our fourth estate. We need a variety of different voices. We need a variety of different people who are funding and putting forward, obviously by virtue of that, their different lens and points of view. I mean, that's critical for debate just as much as we talked earlier about that political difference of opinion is. As such a huge, and increasingly with this 24-hour news cycle, we're enormous consumers of information. We look to these sources increasingly to be our source of truth, our source of fact, our lens of interpretation on the issues that are going on. And it is important, I think, regardless of your opinion, that he's certainly not the only voice, regardless of which side of the lens you may be on whether he's positive or negative.
I'll actually throw that back to James. I mean, how do you play Rupert Murdoch if you evidently don't have a great deal of respect for him and worry, obviously, about his political operation?
Well, I'm playing a character called Rupert Murdoch who has this journey in the play. It's not Rupert Murdoch. I have no idea what goes on in Rupert Murdoch. I don't understand this. His voice certainly is louder than anybody else's voice. The comparison for the ABC versus commercial television, those corporations that control commercial media have a much louder voice in the discussion, and so I don't understand the concept of the radical center. I must tell you, I think there is a polarity, but I think that what Rupert Murdoch puts out there is a disguised propaganda. And it is confusing to people. It is not helpful to the dialogue. I don't watch his shows here. I don't watch his shows back there either. But we have guys like Hannity and the shows on Fox, which are screeds for attacking anybody who disagrees with the free market system as the panacea of all possible ills. And I must say, I don't know. I take to disagree, but for Indigenous issues in Australia, it may be he may be wonderful, and the Stewart cases happens to be in our play. But in our country, our Aboriginal people are invisible. They exist. They are persecuted. They are impoverished. They are ignored. They are ripped off by the government and by the people, Anglos who surround them. There's not a mention. There's not a word. You don't see anybody. So I think if you're going to have If you're going to have a dialogue about some things that are important, everybody has to have a voice.
Noel, do you want to briefly respond to that?
Oh, well, some of our most gut-wrenching fights for the rights of our people in relation to land and the ability of our people to develop and have employment and so on have been supported by Murdoch's papers solely. Not a word from the ABC, not a word from Fairfax. The Murdoch press has argued for our right not to live in poverty. And they've supported us in the fights. They've also supported justice for deaths in custody, the Mulrunji case in Palm Island. The Australian newspaper left every other outlet for dead in advocating Mulrunji's case in the death in custody at Palm Island. So I detect in Murdoch, and I've met him a number of times, I detect basic Australian fealty to the Indigenous people. There is a human being under the mogul. And I think that whatever he might do in the United States, the way in which he's influenced his outlets here in Australia, I can't be more thankful for the support they give us in our causes. People might not agree with the causes I advocate, but they are causes about land rights, human rights, but also about welfare reform and economic development. We've got to have both. And we've got to combine those two things in an intelligent way, because it can't just be that we live off a leftist prescription and abandoning the rights prescription. We've got to bring the two together.
I'll just give the final word on this to Waleed. You've been listening to this. Bring it together.
It's interesting listening to Noel speak, and he would have followed the coverage of Indigenous affairs in the Australian far closer than I have. I think there is, at some point, there's a marriage of convenience that goes on where Noel is advocating certain positions that do generally fit with the philosophical direction of the Australian, being, a free market orientated newspaper that's not terribly fond of symbolic aspects of reconciliation, for example, has been, either in the form of its editorials or in the form of its columnists, very critical of things like the apology to the stolen generations or whatever it might be. I take Noel's comment seriously. I also know, though, that if I wanted to find a voice in the Australian media that was going to, for example, deny that there were stolen generations, I'd probably only find them in the Murdoch press. So there's this sort of complicated toing and froing that goes on. And, and Noel would know better than me. There are plenty of people in Indigenous Australia who are highly critical of the way that Noel approaches these things and would say that that particular agenda will never get any kind of play in the Murdoch press, and it's more likely to get some kind of play in the ABC or the Fairfax press.
I suppose the other point of view is absent in the other press, though.
Yeah, and that might be a fair criticism.
You can't find a kind of development supportive voice in the ABC.
I suspect there are perspectives that are absent in just about any press or any outlet that you choose to. So that observation alone, I don't think gets us very far. I take it, but I don't think gets us very far. The one final comment I would say is I think I don't have an objection to the existence of the Murdoch press or anything like that. I do have an objection to the concentration of media ownership, and clearly Australia has a problem in that regard, particularly when it comes to newspapers outside Melbourne and Sydney. There is a problem there. And I think anyone who's into a diversity of journalism would accept that fact. I would say, though, that I think sometimes the influence of the Murdoch press is overstated. Yeah, sure, it's influential.
I'm just going to interrupt you there just quickly to go back to our questioner, and then we're going to, maybe you can just make a comment, actually, because we need to move on to other things.
Sorry, Jay, I find it completely ironic that James is actually playing this role, but also I think that the question I wanted answered is that Murdoch controls 35% of the ownership of newspapers, yet 70% of readership. is the figures that I've read. Now,
That's right.
I'll be open to debate on that. However, wouldn't that indicate that what they're saying is what people want to hear rather than what they're dictating to is, or that he's actually dictating to people anyway? I don't understand.
Okay, Jamie, quick
concept.
response because we've got to move on.
I don't know who determines what people want to hear. I think individuals determine what they want to hear. It's surely their participation is, is out of habit. They pick up the paper, they read the paper, they like the celebrity, they like the titillation. They're not particularly interested in delving very deeply if it doesn't affect them personally. And so it's just habitual. The dialogue has got to be raised, and I don't believe it's going to be raised by Mr. Murdoch.
Okay, we're going to move on. Our next question is from Noni Betts.
Holly, you've said that this may well be the first generation of young people who are actually worse off than the generation before. I'm wondering if the panel can have a response or reaction to that in the light of current issues such as the way higher education is now once again out of the reach or becoming out of the reach of many young people, the rising rate of young Aboriginal suicide, youth unemployment, the inequality between rich and poor that's increasing, and the way that politics and ideology seem to be putting aside the national and global interest in areas such as the battle against climate change.
Okay, it's going to be hard, a longish question, but we'll keep our answers relatively brief so we can get through more questions.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Noni, thank you for the question. I guess I'll provide context before the panel jump back in. I've had the privilege of leading the Youth Summit for the G20 this year, and in line with that, we've been leading the cause of youth unemployment globally. We've got a state of play right now where leaders globally, not young people, are talking about a lost generation. The fact that we've got 600 million young people right now, 1 in 6 global youth that aren't in education, training or employment. And the scary thing about that is not just the immediacy of that challenge here and now, economically, politically, socially. It's the fact that the ILO's data shows that that's setting up an inequality for life. So you look at the ramifications of being long-term unemployed for 12 months under the age of 24. It sets up a lifetime earning differential. So a young man 10 years on is going to be earning 23% less than his male counterpart, 16% less if you're female, and that goes well into your 40s. So the challenge that we've got right now is making sure, and we were very happy with the outcome of the G20 this weekend, seeing leaders reprioritise the issue. The proof will be in the pudding in how domestically we enact that and move to take change on it. But I think the really important thing is the impetus behind this. You know, not just the G20 commitments, COP21 next year, the Sustainable Development Goals. We are absolutely in need of action from our leaders to ensure that the forecast challenge, that situation you talked about of having a generation that unfortunately don't enjoy the standard of living that their parents do, doesn't become a reality.
You're talking about the global picture here, but of course you said each individual country has to deal with it. And in Australia, the unemployment is highest in regional areas. It's highest still in Aboriginal communities. So
absolutely.
What are the fundamental, and briefly if you can, the fundamental thing that has to be done here?
Well, I think the challenge here, youth unemployment isn't removed from our backyard. It's sitting at around the 20% mark now. Disturbingly, as I spoke about those figures of the ramifications of the long-term youth unemployment, that rate's tripled for us in the last 6 years. That's at 18% now. So we've got enormous challenges. Firstly, in providing a complete education for young people. When we were at 13% youth unemployment earlier this year, 67% of those young people hadn't made it through high school. So that's a challenge. That extra 7% we've got are predominantly people that are coming out of university with a qualification and are joining a jobless queue. So the second part we've got to deal to is the skills mismatch. The fact that we've got people coming out with qualifications that the market's needs aren't matching with. So we've got the structural conversation around education and how we better create an education pathway that leads to a job opportunity. And the second part we've got is actually in the immediate term, how do we address and provide greater incentives for businesses to create pathways for young people into work, as well as the opportunity to encourage youth entrepreneurship and see young people be able to create their own economic opportunities.
Noel, if you could address the notion this could be the first generation of young people who'll be worse off than the generation before. Does that apply equally in the Indigenous community? More so? Less so?
Well, obviously more so. I think we don't have a progressive alternative policy. The paradigm that commands the heights at the moment does not have a compelling alternative. And progressives have never developed a a compelling alternative. We don't have an alternative to the so-called neoliberal paradigm. One thing I will say, in the 80s, voters in Australia, as across the West, voted for a set of policies that would grow the cake. We all agreed with that. We agreed with a set of policies to grow the cake. What happened, though, was the slices of the cake also changed. And I think the two things have become conflated. The growing of the bigger cake through a set of neoliberal policies. But of course, one of the consequences has been there's been changes in the slice of cake that different sectors of our community get out of that deal. And
You're talking about the levels of inequality, inequity, the fact that the richest now...
And the fact that people do so well and some people do so poorly, and particularly the young in our community. And I suppose my point to progressive people who are anxious about this is that what is our alternative policy? Have we developed an alternative economic policy that agrees with the growing of the cake, but tackles this fundamental problem that's arisen where the relative slices that people are getting, the winners and losers and so on, has also altered.
Let me go to Amanda Vanstone. Is it time that a government decided that this was in fact a national emergency?
Well, I just lost my train of thought for a moment there. I'm not sure that it is fair to say that this is a crisis unlike any other. I've got it back now. We want more. You know, when I was a kid, kids shared a room. 3 or 4 kids would share a room, or 2 kids would share a room. It's not considered appropriate by many kids now. Now we've got kids who don't want to go to school because they haven't got the right brand of sneakers, for God's sake. I mean, we are very materialistic, and we've now got bigger houses with more cars, and we say we're worse off because we haven't got as much income left. So I think we need to look at what we want. But I think the fundamental issue, I mean, it's a galactical question, and Tony says be brief, so you raised about 20 different issues, so let me just pick one. When I was the education minister, and at other times, the saddest thing that would happen is you go to a school, you ask a kid, what are you going to do? And they start their answer with, well, I probably won't go to university. We have become a nation that says you're successful or not, depending on whether you go to university. People, and especially those who've been, are very dismissive of those who haven't, and that has taken the focus off everybody being taught at school to do the basics and be a decent person, and showing decent respect for people, not just because you've got some letters after your name, because you happen to be a human being and you can look after yourself.
Well, one of the reasons that young people strive to go to university, one of them, is that you get higher income if you have a degree. That's proven.
Well, of course, when they don't want to increase fees, they argue that that isn't true.
No, but the government argues it is true.
Yes, I know.
That's the point.
I know, but I just make the point. Is it still a third of school leavers that go to university? Is there anyone here who can say that that isn't true? That we have built a community that shows more respect to people with a degree than those without, and I think that's a core part of the problem, because you've got a lot of kids who are never going to go to university who are trained to think that they're no-hopers, and it's the biggest crock of you-know-what that we have to deal with.
It's also partly a problem because the university has been reconceived as a vocational thing. I mean, once upon a time, a university was a place of learning, and that was kind of its function, was to provide education, not to provide vocational training. Now you can't have a conversation about a university that isn't about the job that's at the end of it. And that's just part of the transactional nature of our society.
But it is still true that a very large proportion of school leavers are not going to go to university, and they are not shown appropriate respect.
I'm going to bring in Jamie here. You've been listening, and I noticed with a wry smile for quite a bit of it. But I also remember a statement you made just recently. If young people don't start fighting authority pretty soon, there won't be any water to drink or enough food to eat.
That's correct. Yeah, I thought the question had to do with the quality of life for the kids, young people coming up, their ability to have the life that we've been fortunate enough to have. And I don't think anybody can answer that in the affirmative right now. And so is this conscious? Is somebody responsible for this? I disagree totally that there's not an alternative. I disagree with the idea that growth is the solution to everything. That is, to me, a cancer that we have to develop, that we mustn't, that we have a responsibility to are the generations to come in terms of the environment, in terms of their ability to have an education. In our country, what we've worked out is the two things. If you happen to be white, you get to go to college, but you have to borrow the money from the federal government to do it. By the time you get out, you owe $150,000. You have to pay that money back, which means that you can't really leave a job. You can only take specific jobs that will pay you. So in other words, they've hooked you right into the system. If you happen to be a person of color and you happen to be bright, pretty soon you're going to be in the jail system, because the real profit made out of young black people is to put them in jail, and the government then contracts for the support of the people, of the corporation that runs the jail. So I think the system is broken. Every piece of it is broken. I think the only people who are going to be able to solve this is the young people themselves. But we're going to have to pay for it ultimately one way or another, whether it's in taxes, whether it's in the quality of our life. Nobody's going to get out of this for free. And we better do something quick. Because
can I just say that I think we should pay for it?
Yeah.
I think we should pay for it because young people coming out now, I mean, graduate unemployment has never been higher. I don't agree with what you said, Amanda, there, that everyone aspires to go to university. I've been a teacher for 37 years. They don't all aspire to go to university, believe me.
But do you agree that the ones that don't are not treated with the same respect as the people who do?
No, I don't agree with that either. No. Not at all. And a lot of the kids who go to university don't really want to go there. Their parents are pushing them to go. Or they feel this, kudos that they have to go. But it's not because their peers think the better of them for going. I mean, most kids just want to get out there and get a job, or to have some direction that they feel motivated and inspired by. And it's certainly not always university. I think we do have to pay for it, James, because as a baby boomer, we've had it pretty good.
Okay,
and
you're almost on the panel at this point. You're doing so well. But well done. I'll just get a quick answer from Waleed. Want to get in on that, but keep it brief because we've got a few things.
One element we haven't really discussed is the role of employers and corporations in this. And if we're talking about youth unemployment, what's actually interesting is that there's quite a bit of money sloshing around multinational corporations for hiring people.
That's because they don't pay any tax.
Well, partly, yeah. Partly that's true. But they don't seem to be that eager to spend that money on young talent. And what I think has partly happened is that there's kind of the middle tier of jobs where young, educated people might slot in because they don't have the experience to go to the top tier, but they're too educated to take sort of the more entry-level jobs. That's sort of where they're not hiring these young people. And so I don't know how you fix that. I don't know if you do that with some kind of incentive thing to do with taxation, or you just regulate, or I really have no idea how you fix it. But that seems to me part of the problem. And they're the people actually doing the employing that we haven't spoken about in this conversation, which I find very strange.
And when I say they don't pay any tax, I mean they pay a very small proportion of tax.
Yeah,
now,
that's right.
we've got to move on.
I think less than you pay, roughly, isn't it?
Oh, much less.
Yeah.
The next question is from James Nugent.
Thanks, Tony. My question's for the entire panel. So I strongly believe that there's no such thing as good or evil, only two opposite points of view. Given the increase in radical lone wolf terrorism, does the panel believe that the government has done enough to understand the point of view of these people? Or is our reaction to ISIS simply producing ever more radicalised individuals?
Once again, our time is running out, but Waleed, I'll go to you for a quick answer on this.
A quick one, all right.
Yeah.
I disagree that there's no such thing as good and evil. I'm not a relativist in that way. The point that you make, though, that we don't understand where these people are coming from or how they've ended up in that position, I think that is true. Partly that's because it's easier to develop a response on the basis that they're just insane or they're irredeemably evil, that there is no explanation for what this behaviour is. The behaviour is horrific. And the behaviour deserves to be condemned, but that doesn't mean that it is inhuman in the sense that it is not human behaviour. It is human behaviour. It is understandable with reference to psychology, with reference to sociology. There are all sorts of models of radicalisation that we don't clearly have time to go into now. They exist. But the problem is that once you come to understand them, you begin to see that terrorism is something that has social dimensions to it. There's a social dimension to the problem, which requires then a social dimension to the solution, which becomes a very uncomfortable conversation. It's much easier to express it in military terms, which is why we're much more attracted, I think, to that sort of idea of, well, there's a problem with ISIS, what we need to do is go back into Iraq. And when, however successful that military intervention ends up being, when there is another ISIS or another group that comes along that is inspiring people via YouTube or social media or whatever it is on the other side of the world, well, we'll just bomb that too. And I think there's a cycle there. It's compelling how naive it is that we think that we can break that cycle by repeating it. But that seems to be what we're doing.
But so are you saying that they should be left alone to become a caliphate running all of Syria?
No, I'm not saying that
And
at all.
possibly other countries alongside Syria and spreading through the Middle East over time?
No, the answer to that is no.
So what should you do to stop it?
I'm not saying, but it's not an either-or thing. What I'm saying is that at the moment, the way we approach terrorism is very one-dimensional. See a head, kick it. Problem is that in the process of kicking that head, other heads will pop up and go, what was that? And then that's where the radicalisation process becomes circular. So yeah, I think there are times where there is military intervention. My opinion on this particular one is reserved for the moment, but it's not 2003, which I think was a catastrophe and always was going to be. But the idea that you could take land off ISIS, for example, and weaken them militarily, I think that's an achievable goal. What I think we should not do is assume that by doing that and continuing to do that, we will somehow get rid of the problem. It's not to say it's not necessary to contain ISIS, but don't think you're solving a broader problem by doing that.
I actually quite like to hear from Noel Pearson on this. It's not a subject we often hear you talking about, but obviously it's occupied a huge amount of space in the Australian newspaper, for example, which you obviously read.
I can't speak directly to it. I can only speak about my thinking about assimilation. I came upon the idea that, assimilation is a bad thing. It's been utterly opposed by Indigenous people. We don't want to lose our identity, religion, culture, traditions. But there's one thing in respect of which a process of assimilation is unavoidable, and that is assimilation to the Enlightenment. And I think the problem we're grappling with in Australia, as throughout the West, is that the Enlightenment has been conflated with kind of Western culture, or white fellas, associated with white fellas, when the Enlightenment was a human achievement. It wasn't a Western achievement or a British achievement or an English achievement. It's a human achievement, contributed to by people from the Arab states and China and India. All over the globe have contributed to the Enlightenment. And I think we're on a wrong course here in Australia when we insist on Muslims kind of assimilating on the basis of, well, you've got to be like the white fellas of Australia, when really the essential, and the same goes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. The only assimilation, if I might use that very untrusted word, the only assimilation that should ever be a kind of requisite of citizenship is assimilation to the Enlightenment.
And what do you do when a phenomenon pops up like ISIS, which is sort of the antithesis of the Enlightenment?
Yes, and absolutely, it's got to be opposed. And I think that, but the way in which we deal with our own citizens who might be attracted to radical ideologies like that is not to hector them about the superiority of the white Enlightenment, but the human achievement of the Enlightenment, which is as much a heritage of Muslims and Indigenous Australians as it is for Anglo-Australians.
Jamie?
Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. Thomas Jefferson was a terrorist. The 9-year-old boys playing on the beach in Gaza, they're terrorists. It's a very easy definition, and of course they always jump to...
But Thomas Jefferson also helped to write the Declaration of Independence.
No, he did not. I believe Franklin.
Not the Declaration of Independence.
Franklin wrote that, and if he did, he had a very good day doing it, because the rest of his policies were not, as far as, in my opinion.
We talk about Jeffersonian democracy anyway.
We do talk about Jeffersonian democracy, but we don't have a democracy, and they didn't develop a democracy. They wanted a republic. They created a republic for very wealthy landowners to maintain their power, and they created a constitution where black people were worth 2/5 of a white person, and women didn't have any vote at all. They had no voice at all, even though John Adams' wife harangued him, said, "What can you possibly be thinking? What do you think I am? We are." So their point of view on many things I completely disagree with. But the idea of the terrorist as though the culmination of the frustration that people feel when they are oppressed, which finally comes out in taking very, very inappropriate actions, because violence never accomplishes anything. And then you say, you see that person is a terrorist and that person should be condemned, and I agree with you, and they try bombing it. The solution that we have, and the Americans have, everything should be bombed. That's if you got a problem, you just bomb it. If we have a problem with drugs, we have a war against drugs. We have a war with poverty, a problem with poverty, we have a war against poverty. This is a very defeatist way of thinking about it, and will not work ultimately. These people have aspirations. They had aspirations in Iraq. They are misguided. Their tactics are deplorable. But the Arab Spring and what happened in Libya and Tunisia and in Egypt, and the response to putting down those kids in the street in Tahrir Square, that is, to me, that's the terrorism of the state.
Amanda Vanstone.
Well, there seems to be general agreement, thank heavens, that what ISIS are doing is pretty horrific, and they shouldn't be allowed to just behave as they are and try and set up a caliphate. Seems to be agreement on that. What's happened as a consequence of that, however, I think is just yet another ugly bout of discomfort for good and decent Australian Muslims, and probably in other places around the world, where people are, quite understandably, when the proposition is that someone will be beheaded in a public place, as has happened in the United Kingdom, etc., another round of uncertainty about welcomeness. And in most things, actually, certainly religion and probably politics, it's extremists who cause the vast majority of the problem. Perhaps coming back to Noel's suggestion that there needs to be some radical centre, even if you don't entirely get what he's saying, I get part of it. It's a terrible thing that Muslim Australians who've lived here for years can feel in any way uncertain about whether they're welcome standing next to someone. And that's happened because of these radical extremists. Now, I think beheading's disgusting. Most people do.
Has it been compounded by the government response?
Well, let me just make this point. It is disgusting. I think it's terrible. But I read the other day that the last beheading by guillotine by the state happened in France in my lifetime. The last putting to death of someone by the state happened in my lifetime. And well, I don't particularly want to be critical of the United States. If you think a quick beheading is terrible, I think an execution that takes 47 minutes is a disgrace.
Disgraceful.
Holly Ransom.
I think I really echo Amanda's points there. I think there's general agreement here that what's going on with ISIS is horrific. I mean the behaviours there, the state of play, what's happening to civilians, the activity that's being taken part of. It's hard. You turn on your TV every day, and it unfortunately just seems to get worse at the moment. And I think the point was well made, though. It's a challenge that that the extremism then becomes the standard by which entire communities of people are judged. And that's a real shame, I think, for our multiculturalism, for the conversation, for being able to deal with this in a responsible manner, and to really ensure that we're taking the right steps so that we're not, as Waleed said, jumping to a conclusion and making a kind of a default reaction as a matter of approach, go in and bomb it. I mean, that's not the way that we get any sustainable
I'm sorry, we're
solution.
just about out of time, but I just want to get Waleed, you've got 30 seconds to respond to this, and maybe we could do it in this way. I mean, if a country like Iraq is badly managed and corrupt and terribly governed as it is, actually ask for Australia's help in circumstances where they face an existential threat from this organisation, is Australia right to go in and help?
I think there's certainly an argument that it can. To me, it's not a question of right and wrong. It's a question of what you're trying to achieve.
It's a question of whether you do it or not,
right,
having been asked.
But what are you trying to achieve by doing it, is my point. And if what you're trying to achieve is that you will rid the world of terrorism in the way that George W. Bush heroically proclaimed he could after 9/11, then, no, sorry, you are doomed to failure, because that is not actually what is... you're never going to defeat the problem that way. This is a region that has been in political crisis for over a century. This is a region that is still recovering, and a lot of people do not understand just how deep and significant this is still recovering from the trauma of colonisation.
I'm being told to wrap it up, Waleed, so sorry about that.
That's all
We're
right.
going to have to
It's just a minor
do that.
point
That's
anyway.
all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel. Holly Ransom, Noel Pearson, James Cromwell, Amanda Vanstone and Waleed Ali. Thank you. And that is it. That is it for 2014. Our special thanks to the millions of Australians who are part of the Q&A audience, who ask questions or join the Twitter conversation. Democracy is all about participation, so we're proud that Q&A has had such an important opportunity for Australian citizens to join the national debate. We'll finish tonight and the year with a performance from the Australian Voices, conducted by Gordon Hamilton. They're performing a piece composed by Rob Davidson based on Noel Pearson's widely celebrated speech at the Whitlam Memorial. Till 2015. Good night.
The reward for public life is public progress. The reward for public life is public progress. I speak to this old man's legacy with no partisan brief. For people like me who had no chance, if left to the means of our families, we could not be more indebted to this old man's foresight and moral vision for universal opportunity. Only those born bereft truly know the power of opportunity. Only those accustomed to its consolations can deprecate a public life dedicated to its furtherance and renewal. This old man never wanted opportunity himself, but he possessed the keenest conviction in its importance. For it behoves the good society, through its government, to ensure everyone has chance and opportunity. Who would not say the vitality of our democracy is a proper mission of government and should not be renewed and invigorated? Who can say that liberating the talents and uplifting the horizons of Australians is not a worthy charter for national leadership? The reward for public life is public progress. The reward for public life is public progress. The reward for public life is public progress. The reward for public life
is public progress.